Okay, good, thank you. So Family Promise has been around since 2001, and we provide emergency shelter to children and their families experiencing homelessness. We do that by a unique partnership with 15 local faith communities. And so those faith communities house our families in the evening and on the weekends. And then we have a day center that they go to during the day. And so that's where kind of all that tough work happens. So we, again, rely on 15 faith communities and over 400 volunteers. When we look at family homelessness in our community, what we consider as family is whatever they define. And so sometimes that means a single parent, sometimes it's both parents, sometimes it's a grandparent raising a grandchild, maybe a mom and a grandma, those sorts of things, as long as they have the child under 18 in their custody. So when we look at the composition of families in our program, about 25% of those are two-parent, 69% are single mom families, and 6% are kin raising their children. So we see a lot of single moms in our community. When we look at over the past 5 years, 22% are two-parent, 56 are single moms, 2% single dads, 11% of that kin, and then some other family compositions. When we look at homelessness in our community and nationally, we see about 51% of our children who we shelter are under the age of 5. Nationally, that's pretty on par too. About 50% of the children who are experiencing homelessness are under the age of 5. When we look at the definition of homelessness, there's a different definition for HUD versus the Department of Education. And so HUD is literally homeless. So living on the streets, living in your car, living in an emergency shelter, or a place not meant for human habitation. When we look at the Department of Education's, they define it more of what we see in family homelessness, which is that couch surfing, living in a motel night by night, staying somewhere with 5 other people. That's what we see in our community. When we look at homelessness in our state, last year we had, or the 2015-2016, we had 1,625 homeless youths in the state of Wyoming, and that's a 141% increase in the last 10 years. So we're absolutely seeing an increase in the number of families and children who are experiencing homelessness. Last year we had 56 families who applied for us, and 23 families from the year before. So again, we're seeing a huge increase in the number of families who are needing emergency shelter. We are able to shelter about 25 to 30% of those families. When we look at the impact that homelessness has on youth, 82% said that being homeless had a big impact in their life. When we look at 71% is the ability to feel safe and secure, impacts their mental health, their physical health, makes it very difficult for them to be in school and to graduate school. 42% said that they dropped out of high school at least once. And 50% said that they had to change schools at least once, and many did so multiple times throughout the school year. So we know it's a huge impact on them mentally and physically, and their ability to maintain and move forward and find self-sufficiency in their future for those youth. So for us, our process to get into our shelter, so we work with a number of nonprofits and faith communities here. CAMIA is one of our largest supporters that we work with. And so we don't provide, at this time, we don't provide that emergency shelter. So if a family becomes homeless, then they will go to CAMIA. CAMIA is housing them. They've done that for a number of years. And then they apply with us. So we do background checks on our families and make sure that the families who are coming in are, the safety of our children is the #1 priority. And so we make sure that that is, in fact, we can uphold that. We're not bringing in folks who are registered sex offenders, people who are using, those sorts of things. And they come and apply with us to do that background check. We determine what their needs are when we do that, and do they have somewhere to lay their head today. And the really unfortunate part in our community is that oftentimes we don't have the capacity to house families. And so we will be full, CAMIA will be full, we'll have a waiting list. And so there's literally nowhere for our families to go. So when they call or come in and they're sleeping in their car, sometimes we have no other options for them. And then once they're in the program, we work with them on case management, life skills training. We do a parenting class, attend an education course. So really helping our parents in all of the areas, not just housing, because we know that there are a lot of contributing factors that unfortunately have led them to the situation that they're in. And oftentimes we do see about 50% of our families are that situational homelessness. And so it was, one great example is we had a grandparents who had to take custody of their newborn grandchild because mom and dad were unfortunately using. And so the child was either going to go in DFS custody or the grandparents could take her. She had so many special needs that she could not go into daycare. She had a feeding tube, she had PT and OT. So one of the parents had to quit their job, and so the grandparents. And so fortunately, when you lose half your income, it's pretty difficult to sustain. So that's a lot of the things that we see is that situational homelessness. We do have kind of that chronic where it's very hard to get out of that situation as well, which I think it's wonderful that we have all three agencies because they're really showing that cycle. And there's options for us to help families and individuals to break that cycle in homelessness. On average, the families stay about 2.5 months is about average for them to get employment or save up money and then locate housing. And oftentimes there's a waiting list for many of the housing as well. And our families face a lot of barriers with housing as well as evictions or bad references, judgments against them, those sorts of things that make it even harder for families to get shelter. Again, that can range anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 months. And so we work really hard with those families while they're in the program. And then we do have 2 additional programs that we offer. And so the second one is our Beyond the Walls program, and that's our formal aftercare. So that's continuing to meet with families, do case management with them once a month after they've exited our shelter. And they get incentives for continuing to do that. So gas cards and grocery cards, non-perishable food if we have some, hygiene products, diapers and wipes, those sorts of things. We've had that in operations for about 1.5 years now. 50% of the families, I think 60% of the families, 62% of the families last year who exited the program chose to participate in that. And 100% of those families maintain stable housing, income, those sorts of things. We have one mom who just started LCCC. Another young mom is going to take her driver's license test next week. And you can imagine, like, that's a huge barrier. And so being able to get families out of that crisis of homelessness and get them into a position where they can breathe for a minute, then we really see a lot of that lifelong changing occurring at that time. When we look at the success of our program, and so we do have numbers that everybody says, this, how do you measure success in there? And so I can tell you all of these statistics, and you guys have those on yours. I would say, however, and that we tell everyone, every day that we safely house a child, that they are fed, that they know where they're going to sleep that night, they know they're in a loving environment, that's a success. So every day is a success to us. When you look at the, 85% of our families exit with income. Before they exit, 74 into stable housing. 92% of the children obtain medical insurance. And then through the various classes and life skills that we teach, 90% of the parents said they report a significant increase in their family satisfaction and stronger relationships with their children. 100% of the children we get in school, and then we do have a yoga and mindfulness group for our kiddos once a week. And so obviously it's self-reporting, but 100% of them said that they felt like that was very helpful and that they can use those skills to help kind of deal with their emotions. So, when we look at what's next, so what's in the future, right now we just started a pilot program. We've been doing it for about 5 or 6 months right now, and it's called our Beyond Shelter. And so what that is doing is that is providing financial assistance for families to do rapid rehousing, so very quickly getting from the shelter into housing, diversion, so taking families who are either in the Comia shelter or who would otherwise be on our waiting list and diverting them to housing instead of the shelter, and then homeless prevention, so helping that from ever happening. And so we received a 1-year pilot grant for that to help 20 families. We've helped 5 families thus far, kind of started it slow since it's pilot. And so what that looks like is we're doing case management every 2 weeks with those families. We're paying for half of their rent, up to $450 for 3 months. And so they've got that skin in the game. They're working towards that self-sufficiency. It gets them in that stable place out of that crisis much more quickly. And then we can address a lot of those barriers or contributing factors. We have very limited homeless prevention and rapid rehousing or diversion funds here in our community. And so this is something that we really identified as a huge need. The second thing that we're working on is the ability to serve more families with a larger family shelter. So one that we could house, up to 10 families or so at any given time. And so taking them out of that emergency of crisis, and then either if it's a good fit for them to then move into that rotation program that we do with the churches, then that's what they would do, or they would stay at that other shelter. And so, obviously that would be lower barrier than bringing the families into the churches. Obviously we wouldn't take, safety is still a priority. And so we still wouldn't have registered sex offenders or anyone who's currently using. keeping those families together, the safety for the children. And when we look at the adverse childhood experiences and all of the effects that all of those things have on the children and what their future looks like, we have to break that cycle as quickly as possible. And so that's what we're hoping to do, is to serve more. When we look at our community partners, it takes a village, obviously, to run any of these programs. So shelter, obviously, like I said, CAMEA, USI, Safe House. So I feel like the shelters work really well together in identifying where is the best fit for those individuals or families, and then making sure that happens. Mental health and medical, of course, looking at education and training for our families. Can't raise a family on $8 an hour. And so we know there are families oftentimes need that help to sometimes get a high school diploma or a trade school or some skills that's going to offer them a livable wage. And so we have some great agencies in the community that do that. Obviously, we're working with the Children's Services. So Laramie County School District is our first call, and making sure that those kids are getting to school at their home school and it's not being disrupted by any means. And Head Start and Tried for those younger ones. And then we work with the various housing agencies. A cool, unique partnership we have is with the Landlord Association. And so some of our families, Shine Housing Authority is a very long wait usually. It's usually about a year or so. When we look at some of the other income-based apartments, sometimes our families don't qualify for those because, again, they've had an eviction and some of those are pretty strict on what those requirements are. And so oftentimes with those families, we find that if you work with an individual landlord, that they're oftentimes more forgiving of some of those things, and we'll work with folks. And so we have a really great partnership with them as well, and help get our families housed very quickly. Additional resources, working with Community Action, TFS, and multiple faith communities and other organizations that make all of this work. And then some pictures of some of our absolutely adorable families. And we are here because every child does deserve that. Thank you.
Stay up there for a minute and then just ask you, are there any questions? If there are any questions online, put them in the chat box, please. Do you guys have any questions for Lori? The increase in homeless youth
For the families who are homeless? Yeah, and so there's a couple things. One of them is that we're doing a better job counting, because families can be very difficult to identify sometimes because they are not traditionally on the streets. The second is increase in housing. Housing is incredibly expensive. The cost of medical plays into that. A lot of our families that come in, they have children who have some sort of medical problems, mental health, those sorts of things. And so those families being able to meet those needs with the financial obligation for that, and then being able to keep a job is very, very challenging. Yeah, so those are some of the things. We don't see a lot of the that stereotype of homelessness. So the substance use, people can say that folks are lazy and they just want this. And I could never imagine, I'm not a parent, but I could never imagine a parent ever feeling comfortable with having their children unsheltered somewhere, unsafe somewhere. And so that's not what homelessness really looks like. Yeah.
We have one question online, Sarah, and the question is, do you know what number of our homeless population are using illegal substances?
I know the number, I don't have a figure on that, but again, I would say when we look at family homelessness, we see a very small percentage. So in the 7.5 years that I've been with Family Promise, we have had 3 families. And so again, a very small percentage of that we're seeing with the substance. I'm sorry. Right now, I would say the 2 largest are that emergency piece, because again, there are families who are unsheltered and we have no ability to shelter them. And then that second one is that helping families get into a place, because that's very hard. And so I think that a lot of our families will struggle in that first probably 6 months or a year. And so really providing that support even after they're in their own place, I think that's very important.
Lori, are they moving into our community, or are these people that have been in our community and now?
Sure. So the majority are folks who are in our community and are experiencing homelessness. We do see sometimes folks will come out of state, but they have ties here. So they grew up here, they have family here, they have friends here. In the 7.5 years that I've been here, I've had one family who was like, there we go. Everybody else has ties here and they stay here. So all of the families that we serve are families who are currently or will be rooted in Cheyenne. So we don't see much of that transient population. Yeah.
Or is that kind of periodic every once in a while?
That happens very frequently. Yeah, we get calls on a daily basis from people needing shelter. And sometimes we have openings and sometimes not. Yeah. So we try to work with them. Sometimes we can kind of get them diverted into housing instead. There are a number of faith communities who sometimes will help with like cost of getting into a place. Sometimes help additionally with the cost of a motel. But unfortunately, there's just not, you know, when the agencies are full, there's not a whole lot of other resources for them. And that's really the awful part, right? Is having to tell a family that. And so that's why that's definitely a priority, is that we have this great need that we're not fulfilling. And it should never be okay for a kid to be unsheltered or unsafe somewhere. Yeah. And you know, sometimes they'll get into like those weekly rate motels, and those are $250, $300 a week. And so when someone gets in that position, it's impossible to get out of that position because you can't save that money to get out of that. And so we do see a lot of families in those positions, or where there will be 2 or 3 families in one motel room. And it's just, yeah, impossible to get out of that.
Lori, the people online can't hear the question, so before you answer, if you would just repeat it and then answer it.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So she was asking if we see that sort of repeated, that families come back multiple times in that situation. And I would say probably maybe a quarter of the families that you will see sometime down the road that they may be in that position again, which is really why we started that aftercare program, so that we can follow those families and prevent them from being in that situation. And we've always had an open door policy that if you need something, come back to us. You're our family, so whatever we can do to help you. You know, if you need advice on something or those sorts of things. Well, we weren't really seeing most of our families coming back to us until they were in that crisis again. And then it's, you know, when someone has $1,000 they owe on their rent and $500 for utilities, it's almost impossible to get out of that situation. You know, one mom that's in our aftercare program, she was sick, her daughter was sick, so she missed some work, and she couldn't afford $40 of her daycare bill. And so you can imagine that very quickly could snowball and put her back in that crisis of homelessness. But we were able to cover that $40 daycare bill for her, so that, you know, that really did prevent her from being in a terrible situation again. So we don't see it, yeah, all that often. But you know, sometimes, and that's the hard part, is sometimes getting those folks who have just kind of been in that generational poverty and that cycle of homelessness for a long time, that chronic, sometimes that's very difficult. And that's where like that very intensive case management and then the follow through for at least a year afterwards. And when we look at our aftercare, we don't have an end date on that. And so initially when we started it, we said 2 years. And so families could do aftercare up to 2 years. And then we went to a national conference, and they said that when you look at the majority of the families that we see again are single mothers. And when you look at that, those single mothers, when they exit the shelter and move into housing, can maintain for 3 years. And then after that, the rate of their ability to maintain drastically drops. And the reason for that is a lot of it is mental health. And so they've been able to deal with some of that past trauma or those sorts of things for that long, and then it just sort of catches up to them. And so, yeah, so that's why we said, you know, there's no time limit on this, so that we can stay with those families for a long period of time and help them. Any other questions? Thank you, guys.
Okay, all right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Trish Peoples. I'm the board president for the Unaccompanied Students Initiative. Before I start, I want to let you know that when you're looking at CAMIA and Family Promise and the Unaccompanied Students Initiative, you're seeing a united front in trying to rid Cheyenne of homelessness. We work very closely together, and we are working out to find the partners that we need to just end this forever. But in the interim, all three of us are needed. So let me just tell you a little bit about the newest member of the triumvirate, really. So we started a few years ago because there was a point in time count. We figured out that there were homeless teens who were going to high school or trying to get through high school, and they were suffering from homelessness. And as Lori mentioned, it might not be homelessness living in their car or, you know, on the street, although we've had those. They might be couch surfing, or they just might be in such a toxic environment that they need to leave. So when we did that, we decided that we needed to become our own nonprofit and stand up this nonprofit. And we've only been one for a year. So although we've helped students for the last few years, we became on our own. We got out from under the Laramie County Community Partnership. It was a wonderful birthing process. Don't worry, we're still good friends with them. But it was time for us to move on our own. So our mission is to provide safe, stable housing and develop those support systems so that these kids can finish high school. Since we started, we've had 21 students graduate, and we will help these students graduate in any form that they need to graduate. We've had students graduate from each of the 3 traditional schools here in Cheyenne. We've had students graduate from Triumph, which is the second chance school. And we've had 2 students who have completed the high school equivalency test, or a high school equivalency course out at LCCC. And that's been very helpful because some of the students that we run into have aged out basically of the school system. They won't be allowed back in. And so they can go out to LCCC and do the high school equivalency test. We had some really good examples there. Like I said, one of the guys was 20. He had pretty much given up on graduating, but we got him through. One of the students had missed many weeks and months of school because she was living with her mother, who was a chronic addict. And she just was absolutely sure she was never going to graduate from high school. And we got her through the LCCC. Took her 2 times, but we got her through. So we are very happy about the success rates of what we have. We can't help all of them, but we have helped many. We've also allowed in 3 recently graduated students. Sometimes they graduate from high school, and at that point, their parents abandon them. And they're not ready to make the transition to adulthood. I don't know about you, but the day I graduated from high school, I wasn't ready either. So we have allowed them in. We allow them to stay for a few months to make the transition to the workforce or whatever they feel like they need to do. And we have 1 who transitioned through that program, and we have 2 in the house right now. Okay. When we started, we were using a borrowed house from Holy Trinity, and we always wanted to get houses on our own because we could only handle 3 students at a time when we were at Holy Trinity. This is our first house. It was donated to us in December of 2018. Right now, it is home to 4 girls and a house mom. Obviously, we actually run shift work, so we have someone there with the girls 24/7. Our next one, this is the one that we dreamt about from the beginning. And the next slide, please. And this is the twin homes. It houses 10. Right now, we have 6 boys in it. We have done a lot of work, and the community has been extremely kind and giving. And we have paid off more than half the mortgage of this house. And that also has house parents running shift work around the clock. Now, we have learned a lot in the last year, and we always knew that we wanted to expand because we know we're certainly not the only community that has homeless high school students. And just a few months ago, Casper Highland Park Church came to us. They had a plan, they had a place, and they had some money, and they said, we just need you to help us get started because you've done this already. So how exciting. We weren't ready, but there's kids to help. So actually, it says open February 2020, but we're opening it on Valentine's Day. So that's really exciting. And we're only opening 1 wing right now that will have girls in it, and we hope to have the boys wing open by April. It's going to take a little more work. Next slide. So what have we learned in the past year? Well, most of these kids have some sort of mental health diagnosis. As you can imagine, they haven't come from backgrounds that were stable. A lot of times there's abuse, abandonment. So we have learned that we need to take them in and figure out how to get them help, where to get them counseling, and if they need medication, how to do that, how to, get them on Medicaid and all of those things. The other thing we have found is that sometimes they're not in the best physical health. We have some students who have never been to a dentist. So we have to work with that. And I think that we knew this going in, but I don't think we knew the depth of it, that this would be where most of our time and energy would be, not getting them actually to class, because most of them, not all of them, they're teenagers, most of them want to go to school and attend every class, but a lot of the challenges we have are their mental and physical health. Substance abuse has been a problem. If the student comes in and he or she is committed to staying clean, if they've had a substance abuse issue, not all of them have, then we will help them through that and do what we need to do and what they need for us to do. If they are not, just like in the other agencies, we cannot have someone who's actively using illegal substances in our houses. So, all right, so that is pretty much all I have. If you have any questions, I know it's a new program, so you might. Go ahead. Sure, absolutely. Well, I didn't hear the question. So something about siblings?
Yeah. What do you really?
We haven't had that yet. But I don't see any reason why, we wouldn't allow siblings in. I know that we have had 2 sisters, but they were at different times. So, yes, ma'am.
So my church has been collecting essentials for the community and just going wherever there's a need. I did take some hats up there, and I spoke with Tamara, and she said that snacks would be a good thing to collect and bring to the houses, like food for them. I wanted to know, like she had mentioned snacks, but do you guys need like canned goods? Do you guys get help assistance with that? Are you partnered with anyone? Or is anything good? Because I mean, kids are hungry.
So the question that was asked was, what is the best thing to donate? We do get the staples pretty well. Things we do need, fresh fruits, fresh vegetables, anything with an expiration date, because the things that do not have expiration dates we get, and that's not a problem. Other things that we always use paper goods, toilet paper, paper towels, computer paper.
How about like toilet paper? Are you guys covered with that, or
Right. When we first moved into the house, we had an open house, and we received many more toiletries than we needed, and so they're in storage. So I think maybe 2 or 3 years from now we'll need them, but not now. Not now. Yes, ma'am. Primary source of funding. We are constantly writing grants, and the community civic groups and churches have been very generous, and so we partner with them to get that as well. So. The question is, can we use gas vouchers? Yes, of course. Our age range is from 16 to 21. Right now, all of our students are 18 or 19. They're a little delayed because of their background. We don't have anybody underage right now. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a relationship with DFS? It's okay with kids going to their under 18.
The question is, do we have a relationship with DFS? DFS knows we exist, and we have had a student or 2 recommended to come to us at 18 because they've aged out of DFS. And so our relationship with them is fine. As far as younger, usually if we get someone who is under the age of 18, it's because they do not want to be in the system. They don't want to be part of DFS. And so as far as that goes, usually the parents are out of the picture and DFS can't find the parents anyway. Does that make sense? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, and is DFS and CPF, they're okay with that?
If they're 16, because the law in Wyoming is that you can have a certain amount of autonomy if you are 16, and you can sign contracts and, you know, get a car loan and such if you have a responsible adult helping you, whether that's a teacher or a pastor. So, and DFS is aware of that, and yeah.
So to piggyback off that person about the guardianship with youth and decision making for healthcare and going into college, is this considered foster care?
We are not foster care.
Are they like emancipated
Mm-hmm.
to get federal grants?
Mhm. Yes.
You help,
Do what?
you help the process.
Yes, we partner with people who will do that. We don't do that for them, but we help them get the help they need. Yes. Mhm. You bet.
We have no questions on that.
Okay,
Thank you.
wonderful. Thanks.
I'm sorry, come on up. Okay, no slide, okay.
I don't have any slides for you. I'm just going to talk to you. My name is Robin, and I'm with the Camilla Shelter. So you heard about families and youth, and we do everything else. We've had people in the shelter, we've had newborns, and we've had them all the way up to into their 80s and 90s. And trying to imagine someone of that age being homeless, it's really heartbreaking. We actually now seem to feel like we're more like a nursing home. If you were to come into the Camilla Shelter on any given day, you would see a handful of people either on oxygen or in wheelchairs or walkers. And so we're finding more and more people are aging and don't have the support of a family or don't have retirement, don't have insurance, and they end up homeless and they end up in a shelter. We have one woman who's been with us for 1.5 years, and that's not our policy, is to live there for 1.5 years. But she came here from Canada and her passport was stolen and she can't get back to Canada. So she doesn't have health care, and the only thing she can access is a little bit of income. And her health is very poor, and we know that she's dying, and Camilla is home to her. So she's going to stay with us until she dies. It's just a decision that we've made, and it's not one we like to make, but that's the sad fact of being homeless. Like Lori said, we partner very closely with Family Promise. We take those families in, you know, they'll call us and say, we're in our car, what do we do? We'll take them in, but the first thing that we expect them to do is to call Family Promise and to call Cheyenne Housing. So that's their assignment immediately. We go from there. If for some reason they don't pass the background check or something, for some reason they can't get into Family Promise, then we do give them a limit because that tells us that, you know, the services are probably going to be limited and mom and dad need to get busy and start taking care of things. And that's a tough education too for some of those moms and dads, is because of some of the mistakes you've made in your past, your services are limited. And so we'll allow them to stay, but we do push them really hard to get out there and find work, to find income, maybe look for family members, other ways that they can find support. Unlike the other two, I didn't hear them mention this, but we do have a residency policy. We just implemented that 1 year ago. And the reason was that we were inundated with residents and had not enough resources. So what do you do when you have too many people and not enough resources? You have to figure out a way to limit your people. And so we decided that we wanted to focus on people who have ties to Wyoming. And so our policy is loosely written. It says if you can show ties to Wyoming, regardless of where you're from, then you can apply to our long-term programs. If you cannot, you have 7 days. So we don't stop them at the door and turn them away. We give them 7 days because if they come in on a weekend, they still have 5 days. They can go to day labor. They can, you know, maybe look for other resources and get back on their path to another community. We encourage them to go back to the state of their residency. Because if we're honest, they need food stamps, they need housing, they need some kind of medical assistance or whatever the public services are. They're not going to get those in a state where they are not a legal resident, but they do have those services where they are from. And so we will encourage them to go back to that state of residency, and we'll help them with bus transportation and things to get them there. We try and make sure that they have a support system back in that state so that they're not just going back to another bad situation. But then there's also people who say, I truly did want to come to Cheyenne to start over. You know, I don't have ties here, but I want to be here. Are you going to still make me leave? Well, then they can appeal to us. They fill out a form, and all they have to do is to show us that they have a plan, that they're not just here to milk our community of services and then move on, that they truly have a plan. How many, have they been out looking for work? Have they made some contacts? Are they doing, those kinds of things? And if they show us that they are actively making an effort, we will give them a chance to make Cheyenne their home. So that has proved to be very helpful. What we have actually found is the ones that weren't serious about making Cheyenne their home left very rapidly. And so it wasn't even an issue. The ones that have appealed and we've allowed to stay, many of them have done very well. Some of them we'll say, well, we're not quite sure. We'll give you 30 days and we'll meet again and see how you're doing and see if you qualify for the long-term program. Some of them do really well and we can't wait to get them in the program, and some of them leave long before that 30 days is up. So a lot of those situations work themselves out. So our housing programs go anywhere from emergency services. We have a short-term transitional program, a long-term transitional program, and permanent housing. And so the emergency, again, is for those folks that really aren't eligible for the long-term programs, the 7 days. Once we've determined that they're eligible for long-term, they go into the Journey program, which is a 30 days free in the shelter, and during that time they go look for work. They find a job, we move them into Journey 2. That's where they show us they're going to maintain a job. Lots of people will get a job, but they won't keep that job. And with every one of these programs, we add a few more bonuses. You get to stay in on your day off, or you get to be in on the weekends, or, just different little things that make you want to work towards that next level of housing. The third step after Journey 2 then is pay to stay. You've got a job, you've got a steady income, you put together a budget and you start paying for your stay. You've been here now going on 3 months, and so we have special dorms for that. The women's dorm that's for pay to stay is carpeted. It has private lockers for their belongings, and it has a bathroom in there. So they pay $175 a month for that dorm. Still includes all their food, their hygiene. We help with clothing. The men's pay to stay is in the basement. Theirs is a little bit nicer. They have a private cubicle. They have a kitchen. They have laundry, and they have private bathroom. So they pay $250 for that. Still $250 for private, space is pretty cheap. They still can eat dinner there. The kitchen is mostly for making their lunches and breakfast, things like that. So they pay $250. And then because it's such a popular program with the men, they can be in the regular emergency dorm. Well, anybody, men or women. Women just is never full, unfortunately. But the men who are waiting to get into that basement dorm can live up in the emergency shelter and only pay $150 a month while they're waiting for a space downstairs. That's our short-term transitional housing. They can live there for, we say 6 months, but if somebody is doing really well and their 6 months is up, but they're not ready to move on, let's say their sobriety is just 6 months, and we know that if they move out, they'll probably relapse, we'll extend it. We work with each individual, and so we have the time limits or guidelines. And then we have our long-term transitional housing, which is studio apartments in our upstairs, and they are sleeping quarters, living room, sleeping, private bath, private kitchen. We have 11 units, and they pay right around $400 a month for that. But those are completely independent. They do their own cooking. They're expected to buy their groceries and to buy all of their cleaning needs and things like that. They do earn privileges where they can have weekends gone. They can have guests. We have a couple moms who are they've started to get visitation with their children to try and get their kids back. So we will allow weekend visits with their kids. So that's our. And then the permanent supportive. It doesn't have its own space, but anyone who's gone through any of these programs, especially the elderly that we identify as someone who just really can't do it out in the community on their own, they need that supervision, whether it's because of mental health or just age or whatever it is, they can keep that unit and just pay their rent indefinitely. And we just make those judgments according to each situation. So our partners in the community, besides these folks here, Peak Wellness is probably our biggest our biggest partner, mainly because we deal with so much mental health. They have a crisis team that will come right to the shelter. So we have an individual, you don't have to be a PhD to recognize that someone has something going on and needs that next step up. So we will call the Peak crisis team, and they'll send over some folks that will talk to them. What's been helpful about that is in the past, if someone acted out due to untreated mental health, is we had to call the police because we didn't have any other way of managing that. And so the police came, took them away, and that was it. Well, that's not the solution. And oftentimes the police wouldn't arrest them, they would just remove them from the property. So now you've got this individual roaming around unsheltered, And it just really wasn't that kind of answer we wanted. So now when someone is acting out, Peak Wellness can come over, and very often, probably 9 times out of 10, one of their caseworkers will be able to talk that person down, get them calmed down, and they can stay. We don't have to remove them from the shelter. Sometimes we call them 2 or 3 times a night, but if that's what it takes to keep them in the shelter, keep them sheltered and safe, then that's what we do. They get them tied into their programs, can get them to see doctors and whatnot for medication. We also have the Crossroads Clinic that brings their mobile bus to our shelter 3 days a week, and they see our folks for more of the everyday stuff, colds, flus, things like that. And they can make referrals when, of course, they see something that's maybe needs someone with a little more expertise. And then we have a medical doctor who will make house calls. If we call him and just say, hey, I've got somebody, usually when it's a mental health thing and someone that's not medicated, we'll start with a physical. Even if you refer them to a psychiatrist, they want to start with a physical exam to see if there's anything going on that's presenting as a mental health issue. So he'll come over and do a brief physical, and then he will determine whether or not they need to go see a psychiatrist. We'll advise us from there. We also are the community's feeding program, so we're open every evening, 7 days a week for anyone in the community. So you could show up and have dinner there. We don't ask you to prove anything. You just come in the door, give us your name. We do prefer that you be sober, and we've been a little bit, I don't want to say lax. In the wintertime, we're a little more lax on that, because when it's really, really cold and it's storming out, we have taken people in who are under the influence. We just have to be very careful and watch their behavior, and if anything happens, we do call 911 immediately. But on Thanksgiving Day, my staff actually found a man passed out in the middle of the street in front of the shelter, and it was very cold on Thanksgiving Day, and so they carried him into the building. And we kept him until an ambulance came, but they eventually released him, and he ended up back that night. He did stay the night, and unfortunately, about 2 weeks ago, he was found deceased. So his alcoholism did finally get the best of him. So they don't always know when to come in, and so for that reason, we don't absolutely say no. If somebody's going to come to the door and ask for help, that might be the one chance we have. So we'll do everything we can, to keep them safe for that time being. We do pretty intensive case management. We have a transportation program, so these folks, whether they came to the shelter to stay or were just passing through, a lot of people end up in Cheyenne because of the interstates that cross, and so cars break down, they run out of money, whatever reason. We have a pocket of money that was set up specifically for helping people move on. So it's gas and bus passes that we can help people continue on with their journey. We have laundry vouchers that help our folks do their laundry. I mean, we try and kind of cover as many gaps as we can. Kind of to speak to the other 2 organizations, from a personal perspective, I am a foster parent, and I am right now taking care of one of my foster kids who aged out of the system. She's 20 years old. Well, when she was in high school, they didn't have USI, and she had some severe mental health issues and didn't want to be in my house anymore. So she left my home, and for lack of anywhere to take her, she ended up going to South Dakota to live in a group home for kids aging out of care. She's 18, so she can do whatever she wants. She can make up her own decisions. Well, over the last few years, her mental health has deteriorated, but our relationship has improved. And so right now she's back home, and we're helping her get on medication, get counseling, learning how to do certain things. But my point in saying that is, if she didn't have a foster family that still cared about her, if she didn't have a USI in her community, she would end up at the community shelter. She would be an adult who's homeless, and her issues would continue to get worse. Where that brings Family Promise into play is this young girl experienced so much trauma and abuse as a young child. Her mother went from motel room to motel room, from man to man. They didn't have a family promise that was there to make sure those children were safe. So I'm telling you, the 3 organizations are really important, and the things they do are life-changing. And I end up getting the ones that maybe fell through the cracks. There wasn't a family promise when they were growing up, so now they're at the community shelter. These people they're not bad people. They lived really bad lives, and maybe bad people hurt them. I had an angry woman come in the other day, and she cannot stand me. I'm not sure what I ever did to her, but she hates me with a passion. And if you met her on the street, she would have nothing good to say about me. And this morning, she was telling the staff that she refuses to take a shower because she's sure that I have a lesbian crush on her. Okay, how do I deal with that? This woman is visibly deranged, and I can't have a relationship or a conversation with her because of her thought process, okay? And so you're trying to struggle with people who clearly do not think straight, will not go on medication, will not receive treatment, but I have to show up every day and I have to smile at her and be nice to her, and I have to feed her and make sure she's warm. And that's not everybody who's homeless is that great, wonderful person that's going to be grateful and appreciate what you do for them. And you have to be willing to really serve every one of them. And so the community needs you. The homeless community needs you, and they need Family Promise, and they need USI, and they need CAMEA. So thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. Sure. When it comes to families, because we'll get a call, mom, dad, and some kids, and depending on the situation, we can't always keep the families together. We have very limited space. So our family unit that we have right now is one of our apartments. And so we did that to keep the families separate from the single adults or the children. So if we already have a mom in that room and another family calls, we'll say to them, well, we can put the wife and kids in there, but dad, you'll have to sleep in the men's dorm because we already have a woman in there with her children. And then when that unit's full, we had a family the other day call, and we said, well, we don't have any room in the family unit, but we can put mom and the 2 kids in the women's dorm for the night, and we can put dad in the men's dorm, and they don't show up. If mom and dad can't sleep together, oftentimes they won't show up. I don't know, I guess I've never been homeless to that degree, but I would want my wife and children to be in a bed and with a roof over their head, but that's one of the reasons that people won't stay. Folks that are severely mentally ill practice horrible hygiene. We can't get them to wash their hands. We can't get them to shower, to clean up, to change their clothes. And we've had issues, because we're here talking about public health, we've had issues with some very severe and highly contagious things potentially coming into the shelter. And the more we've learned about it, the medical community has said, well, but that's only, the only people that are at risk are people who don't wash their hands, people who don't practice hygiene. And I'm thinking, well, that's us, because that's what we have. We're not a healthy environment where everyone that comes in the door practices perfect hygiene. And so we're very susceptible to a lot of those communicable and public diseases that are floating around there. So we have to be very, very careful. And a lot of those folks, when we tell them, in order to stay here, you have to take a shower, they'll leave. They will not take a shower. They will leave and give up their shelter before they will bathe. No. No. I mean, a caseworker, everyone has to meet with a caseworker at least once to capture all the information. Pardon me? Oh, I'm sorry. It was, why would people not stay at the shelter? And so, yeah, some of them will let it go for a couple days, but if someone doesn't bathe at some point and they're sleeping in this confined space and you have the heat on, it doesn't take long before that room is really ripe, and the ones who are healthy can't be in there. I mean, it's really disturbing, and you have to make a choice. And unfortunately, we have to make the choice that benefits the masses. And so sometimes we either tell them, either go in there and take a shower and take off those dirty clothes, or you got to go, and they'll hightail it right out the door. Anything else? Oh. We have 96 beds. And then we have about, in the wintertime when it's cold, we have probably another 20 cots that we can put down in the living room and dining room. And very often we'll have 15 to 20 people sleeping on those cots. Very often, yes.
2 questions. My first question is, with that hotel being across the way, is it possible that, like, Friday state funded? Is there, so I guess my question is would it be possible to utilize some of those hotels that are no longer being used on Lincoln Way?
Well, the Atlas Hotel, so can we use the hotels that are in our vicinity? The Atlas Hotel was purchased by Hampton Inn. And so there's a new Hampton Inn going in across the street. So of course, our first thought was, who's going to want a homeless shelter across the street from a Hampton Inn? But there doesn't seem to be anybody wanting us to go anywhere. We currently receive no city or no county money. The only state money we get is if we apply for a specific program, and we are getting emergency shelter money, which is through the state. The only federal money we get is Community Development Block Grant, which is again filtered through the city, but that has to be for a specific project. So very, very limited government funding. The majority of our funding is from people in the community who write a personal check, probably 65%. And we're looking at a $750,000 operating budget for 2020. And, we have a generous community. We write grants, we have foundations, but a lot of the Wyoming money is in Natrona County, and they really serve by region. So it's hard for us to access even Wyoming money here in this part of the state. So it's very challenging. And that's why it's important that we work together, because the three organizations wrote our United Way grant together this year. We were encouraged to do that. So we were the first group of agencies to do that. And so we were group funded. And so we are organizing our programs and our processes to help one another to try and reduce costs and make the most of that money. So those partnerships are really valuable. Yes. I'm sorry? The CAMEA specifically, our greatest need really is always financial, because the community is so generous. We serve 5,000 meals a month on less than $500. And that's because people donate food. Our kitchen budget is $500 a month, and we don't even spend it. But it is 5,000 meals. And so we have someone that brings milk every week. We have someone that brings eggs every week. Those are things we don't have to buy. We have so much meat in our freezer right now that we try and share with our partners. So food is something we have plenty of. Clothing, I have so much clothing in my basement, the walls are bursting. I mean, I can't fit the clothing in there. Hygiene, like they said, we have storage of hygiene. So it's really specific. I mean, but I still have to pay the heat, and I still have to pay my staff. And so those are the things that people don't think about. So money is always the number one need of any nonprofit. It really is. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, everyone. We appreciate you coming out and joining us, and we hope to see you in May. If we're at our new building, we'll be there, but otherwise,